everyone, thanks for joining me today. My name's Erin Eggenburg. I'm here to talk about my new book, The Mending Directory. It's this one and this one, which are both backwards for you right now. It's out right now, both in the UK and the US, and today I just wanted to do a little mending demonstration for you. So let's go ahead and get started. There we go. All right, so this is the pair of jeans that I have to mend for you today. As you can see, I've started this before. I had another mend up here, and so now it's just time to go a little bit further down and address this tear. So what I did first is I picked out my project, and here is the book right side up. Both copies are the same. It's just the cover that's different. The page numbers coordinate and everything, so don't worry about that. So today, since we don't have too much time and visible mending is never known to be something that's a fast project, this is what I've chosen today, is this windmills pattern. It's pretty quick, pretty simple, totally appropriate for a beginner stitcher. So I mentioned that we don't have a ton of time, so what I did is I did a little bit of prep beforehand. So if you look here, let's see, I went to this pattern. This is the one I picked, and then I went to the little envelope in the back that has the transfers. I picked out my pattern from those transfers and then just chopped it out of the paper. After that, what I did is you put your pattern face down wherever you want to transfer that pattern over the top. I put my patch in place first and pinned it around just so I'll already have that step finished. And if you had a lighter patch here, or if I had a lighter patch here, the transfer pattern would have transferred down here onto this patch too. But I like to have a little bit more of a contrast with my mending. So I ironed this on, and sometimes iron-on transfers, especially with denim, if it's a little bit bumpy, it can't get every little line just because there's a little ridge there and the iron didn't get a chance to press it down. So what I did afterwards is I just filled in a couple of the lines that didn't transfer. It's just something that happens with iron-on transfers, is that you have to help it along just a little bit. Okay, so after that, that's where we are now. So I'm going to use this green thread today to stitch with. I always like to take about 3 feet. That's my kind of my standard length, give or take. And then I always like to have a little bit of thread wax handy. This is, when I say thread wax, this is just beeswax, and what I do is I use it to coat the thread, because stitching through denim can be kind of hard. Because of such thick layers, this wax just coats the thread and helps to move it through just a little bit easier. Any old beeswax will work. You don't need anything fancy. And then next is you want to make sure to have a sharp needle. Sharp needles are always important when you're mending denim, because as mentioned before with the thick layers, if you don't have a really sharp needle, it's going to be really hard to stitch through all of those layers. All right, my needle is threaded, and I'm going to make just a little knot on the end here. And then let's take a look at this pattern just a little closer to see what we're doing. Might be a little bit easier to read here. So before I get started stitching, what I'm doing is I'm always going to check out the pattern, and I really like to stitch in directionals. And by directionals, I mean horizontal stitches and then vertical stitches and diagonal stitches. I typically go in a specific order, and that would be vertical, horizontal, and diagonal. But today I'm going to go horizontal. So all of these stitches that are horizontal, I'm going to make first, and I'll go row by row back and forth, and it describes this in the book as well. So if you forget this, don't worry, it'll be there. So I would work all of those horizontal stitches row by row from the top to the bottom, and then I'll come back and I'm going to work my vertical stitches row by row from one side to the other, and then last I'll come back and I'll work all of those diagonal stitches. So one thing about working in diagonals is there's a couple of reasons why you may want to do that. And the first reason is that when we're patching, especially on denim, you really want to work from one side to the other, and then as you stitch, those two pieces of denim come together really well and form a really tight bond. If you were stitching kind of jumping around all over the place, you would have a lot of thread behind, and also you may develop some wrinkles or spaces, or your thread might just pull and it won't end up to be a great mend after all. It may not hold, or it may be something that you can really feel underneath. So by working from one side to the other, we make a tight mend, we make a flat mend, and it's going to feel a lot more natural. Now the second reason for following those directionals is that when you follow the directionals, you don't have to worry about where your next stitch is going to go, because you're only working on one direction at the time, and that's the only stitch that we're seeing as we go. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. It's always a little bit tough when you're working with jeans because you have one hand on top, that's my stitching hand, and I'm right-handed, so my right hand is my stitching hand, and my left hand is my non-stitching hand, and that hand is going to be inside the jeans telling us what's going on underneath. So that's what I'm paying attention to here, is not only what's happening on the top, but what's happening on the bottom as well. And I'm going to roll up these jeans just a little bit so that I can work with a little bit smaller area. Now I don't want to go up too far so that I end up creasing this area that I'm working in, but working with a smaller area is going to be a lot easier than trying to maneuver this unrolled up pair of jeans all over the place. Okay, so now I'm going to stick my hand, my stitching hand, inside, and I'm going to find that first stitch, which is right here, and that can take a minute. And what I've done also is I have pinned my patch in place first, just to make sure that it's really staying in there. You'll also notice that I still have a lot of pins around, and I really want to make sure that that patch stays where it is until I have it stitched in place. So here I'm just going to work those horizontal stitches. Depending upon the thickness of the denim, you may make just a single stitch, you may make more than one stitch. It's really how thick those layers are and how comfortable that is for you. And I have my non-stitching hand behind here, and it's telling me what's happening. Okay, so there was my first row. Now I'm going to go, stitching this last stitch of one row and then moving down to the next row. You see how I've moved my needle from this space to this space? And then I'm not going to pull it too tight. After every row, you want to leave just the tiniest bit of slack so that these stitches can kind of rearrange themselves and it won't be too tight. So all denim has a little bit of stretch. So if you leave that little bit of slack, the denim will stretch and it'll adjust those stitches. If you don't leave that little bit of slack, your thread will likely break, especially if you're mending on a knee. And it can be helpful just to kind of keep flipping your project around so that you're always stitching right out in front of you. It's really hard when you start to try and stitch towards you. It's going to be uncomfortable and it'll give you a wrist ache after a while. So here I am just stitching forward here. And what I have here is a pin that I can take out because I've moved past that area, so it is nice and tight and in place. I'm going to move this camera down just a skosh. Okay. Now, let's finish out this little row. Oops. And if one needle keeps kind of poking into you, you can move it around so that that point is facing away from your finger. It seems kind of obvious, but when you're in the middle of stitching, you don't always think about those kind of things. Okay. Oh, this red pin wants to sneak out, so we're going to put that one back in place, and now I'm turning again, and I'll turn more with the first layer of stitches or the first directionals of stitches, and the reason why is just to keep everything at the right tension. I'm always worried about tension for the first set of stitches. Just because of that little pulling issue. And this patch goes a little bit farther over here, which I'll trim up later, but I want to keep that flap from moving on to where I'm stitching, so I will keep this pin in the jeans for now. And then just stitching through here, and since my fabric was a little too dark for the transfer to happen, you may have to guesstimate a little bit if you use something really dark. Or actually, let's just do this, because that's a tough thing to pull off, especially when you're just beginning. So what I'm going to do here is just add a few lines so that I'm really following my stitch pattern here. Okay, that one's on there still. And then there's this row. And this is just going to keep my pattern a little bit more consistent. And if you're just beginning, you may not want to do so much contrasting fabric. You may want to go with something a little where the transfer will transfer onto all of the layers rather than just the two, or just the lighter layer. Just match your fabric up is what I'm saying. All right. And stitch in here, and then we'll move to the next row down here. And I will flip my pants around so that I'm stitching forward, always trying to stitch forward. And just notice that I have one hand on top and my other hand is under here, so you can't see what's going on with my other hand, but it's giving me a lot of information about what's going on the underside of this project. And when you're pulling your thread through, you never want to pull really hard on your thread. This little eye of the needle is so small that it's really easy to break. So just making sure to kind of tug out your project here and there just to make sure that those stitches do have the proper tension. You don't want anything to be too tight or those stitches will pop, as discussed earlier. All right, and now I'm going from one row to the other, just going right down here. And those little needles, the pins can really tangle up your thread, but they serve an important role. So as much of a pain as they can be, they're really important to keep in your work until those stitches can really stay where they are without the pins, or your patch can stay where it is without the pins, rather. Okay. And searching for that stitch to come up. There we go. Pulling through. Adjust a little bit. And I'm always just using one length of thread. It's not doubled up, in other words. So it will be doubled up at the top because I have my my tail of thread here. So I'm always adjusting it so that I'm just using one thickness of thread. Once you start using multiple thicknesses of thread with denim, it can get really tough to stitch because you're going through those thick layers. So just to make it a little bit easier. And I'm also, I forgot to mention this earlier, I'm using a crochet cotton here. It's about a size 8 is what I would be using if you wanted to convert it to like a pearl cotton. All right, and that pin is ready to come out. It's always a lot more freeing when you can start taking those pins out. You see here, I'm just stitching as we go, just working on those marked stitches from this pattern. And I'll tell you what, when you're first beginning, it's not going to look like a whole lot. It's just going to look like a little bit of a mess of stitches and what's going to happen here to bring all of these together. But with each directional, it'll really start to come together. So stick with it, and I really think you'll be surprised when you get to your second directional. After you start working that, you'll definitely start to see the pattern start to show up. All right, and I've pulled that not too tight. I've got a little bit of slack at this end so those stitches can adjust without popping. And you can choose to collect stitches on your needle or just make one stitch at a time. Depending upon, that goes back to kind of the thickness of the denim. Sometimes you can't always collect stitches on your needle, or if you're just beginning, you may just want to make one stitch at a time because it'll be a lot more straightforward. But the more practice you get, the more you can start collecting multiple stitches on that needle, and it'll really make the process go much faster because you're making more than one stitch at a time. So your rows, you can really start to collect all of the stitches from that row onto the needle. So you're working one row at a time at that point. And that's what starts to speed it up, because visible mending is just not a speedy process. It's slow, it's meditative. You're really thinking about what you're doing as you go. Leaving a little slack there. And you can kind of flick the slack with your non-dominant hand, or you can kind of yank out, just kind of pull on the fabric, and that'll help to loosen the stitches as well. And you want to do that kind of intermittently as you're stitching. Don't wait until the end. Do it sometimes in the beginning, in the middle, all the way throughout your mending, and that'll really make sure that those stitches are a little bit flexible. So there's that. If I did a full row of stitches at once, and you just have to watch those pins because of course it wants to get stuck. All right, so there's a full row. Now one more, and I'll flip my jeans around. It can be a little bit dizzying to watch. Let's take a little look at where we are. All right, we're coming around. green guys coming out. Let's poke them back in. Okay. Next row. So we have 2 more rows of this directional left, and then we will move to our vertical rows. These are horizontals. I really love mending denim, or just, I mean, mending in general, but kind of a really nice thing about mending with denim is that you can stop in the middle of a row if you want to. You don't have to commit to completing an entire project when you sit down to get started. You can work on the same project for like a month if you wanted to, and you don't have to worry about your threads unraveling. And when you work in directionals, you don't really have to think about making sure that you're marking where you were when you left off with this project, because when you take a look at the stitches and the directionals, you'll just know where your next stitch will go. So there's a lot of, it's kind of self-corrective in that way. All right, so there is my first layer. Now I'm going to poke this needle through to the underside, and I'm going to pull my patch out. So right now I'm looking at the underside, and here's my needle that I pulled through. And what I'm going to do here is just weave my thread through a few of the stitches. I'm going to leave a little bit of slack in case it needs it. And then something to note here. Let's cut my thread off here. There we go. So here's the underside, and as we stitch, so I kind of just wound my thread in here underneath some stitches, and as I work those other layers of stitches, it will cover up this thread end, and so this isn't going to, you don't have to worry about this coming undone. Okay, turning back right side out, and I am always, I didn't mention this either, but anytime I work this type of mending, I'm always looking at the right side as I stitch. I don't ever have it flipped inside out and stitching on that side. I'm always looking at the correct side, or the outward facing side, I guess. Okay, now time for more thread. And I'm just pulling my thread through to coat it. And I just kind of stick my finger over the top of this tin that contains beeswax and pull it through just like that. And then I'll just sort of rub my fingers along the thread to sort of distribute that thread, or that beeswax, a little bit more evenly. Okay, now you have to remember where you put your needle once you rethread. Okay, and I will say threading is a necessary evil of mending, so it's really just something that you kind of get used to, and muscle memory takes over at some point. I like to put a little bit of extra beeswax on the end because it stiffens up that end and can sometimes, definitely when I'm not on camera, make it easier for threading. There we go. using a needle, a sashiko needle, and I'm using this particular needle because these sashiko needles have really small eyes. So if you notice here, this tiny eye, it's the same size as the rest of the needle. And the reason for that is if I had a larger eye, it would be really, it might, if I were working on something a little more delicate, it might stretch out that hole, but it's also just going to be a lot harder to pull your thread through. Whoops, what happened here? It's going to be a lot harder to pull your thread through. What was I saying? Oh, sorry. I've got a technical issue here. So let's just cut that off. I think that's the right one. All right. Oh, if you had that bulby eye, it's going to be a lot harder to pull through the fabric because it's going to make a larger, it would need a larger hole to go through. So these little eyes just make it a lot easier to work the needle through. Okay, so we worked all of those horizontal stitches row by row. Now I'm going to come back and work my vertical stitches row by row, just going from one side to the other. It doesn't matter which side you start on as long as you start on a side. And we're just building on our stitches before. So once you have this first layer, we already know that all of the stitches we need to work with are right here. So we can just start, we don't have to worry about our marks as much because we're just building off of stitches that previously exist. So I'm going to go ahead and start on this left side and bringing my needle up through the mark of the bottom stitch. And where'd that come from? I'm going to start to roll the top of my jeans down a little bit again, just to give myself a little less area to work with. It tends to unravel as you go. And then here, I'm going to work up all of these stitches. And I'm building on those horizontal stitches. It uses the same space to stitch through, which makes it really easy to locate. You can see there. I'm just going to work a few stitches at a time. And pull through. Leaving a little slack there at the beginning. And then I'll stretch this out and show you in just a sec here. So see there? There's our row of vertical stitches, just building on those previous stitches, and you can already see more of a pattern coming out, which is, I just think is so cool. Like all of a sudden there's a pattern that begins. And what do I see here? So if you get lost, okay, so I went up on all of those, right? Okay, there we go. Pulling out that tail. I don't always trust the pattern, which is kind of a problem, but sometimes you just need to refer, just to remind your brain of the direction it's going. And then just kind of go on like that. And I will say, if you make one stitch that's kind of out of line, it's not going to be a big difference because you're making so many different stitches the one stitch that's out of place will not be noticeable. And the reason why, so I use this type of mending all the time for jeans, and it is incredibly strong. It's it doesn't seem like it would be, but all of these little stitches work together and they create a really strong mend. Well, that guy's a little out of line, but that's okay. Something happened with my transfer. And I'm working just about 3 stitches at a time here. Not pulling the thread too tight. That's like probably the key thing here, is tension is really, really important. And last of the row. Look at that. We really have a pattern coming out. Adjust that tail so it doesn't get worked in. It's really easy to forget about that tail. And then you'll have to spend some time kind of digging it out. So just pay attention to it and it'll make everything quite a bit easier. Stretching it out. This type of mending, you're really using 2 hands. Your non-dominant hand is telling you a lot of information. Where your needle needs to go, just making sure that the thread hasn't gotten a knot or a tangle on the underside. Alright, now I'm going from this row to the next row, so I make kind of a diagonal stitch here. Alright, and I can kind of keep my hand here for this round, I think. All right. Okay. Pulling that through right there, and next row. So the next ones we go down. And switching sides. Oop, that one's a little longer distance. Oops, I pulled out a needle there. And I'm going to keep this one in because my patch is a little, there's knot stitching right here, as you can see, so that flap of the patch wants to move over. When I'm finished, what I'll do is I'll just trim off the patch. And I could do that right now too, but since I'm in the middle of stitching, I will not do that. I'll just wait until the end and keep those pins in place. There's no wrong way to do it. If you would prefer to take them out now, go ahead and take them out now and trim it up, but I kind of like to stay in my stitching momentum once I'm there. All right, flipping around. And these transfers, something great about them is that you can also use them more than once. Since they're iron-on, you don't use up all of the ink in one shot. Okay, so there is the last of this row, beginning of the next row. There we go. I'm flicking with my finger just to leave that little bit of slack underneath. All right, and stitching up. Okay. Pull it out, make sure that nothing's going to pucker later. If you notice any puckers, what is happening there is that your stitches are too tight and they will probably pull out later. So pay some attention to tension. It's worth it. What's that one? All right. Oh, there we are. That one got a little bit out of line, but it's okay. All right. Now from this row over to this row. Poke those pins in here, and this stitch is an extra one that I added, so I am going to ignore it for now, and I'll probably just leave it there. It's not hurting anything. It won't make a super huge difference in the pattern. It's just a little mistake, and the chances of anyone else noticing it is pretty slim. I'll probably notice it forever, but no one else will. All right. And last row here. Let's take a look now and see where we are. Okay, so you can really see that pattern coming out, right? That's pretty cool. A little shorty stitch there, that's okay. All right, now I will go ahead and just start a new thread. I could start my diagonals from here, but I know I'm going to need a lot more thread, so I'll just go ahead and start a new thread. Now I'm going to turn this inside out and do just as before. Well, let me show you this something if you're following along. If you look on the back side, there's a pattern that will work out on the back as well as on the front, which is pretty cool. You can kind of see that happening. All right, and I'll just weave that through a few spaces underneath and then trim that off. The reason why I don't end with a knot, I'll start on a knot because I'm starting on the side, so that's not going to be in the middle of my knee, but when I end, I don't want to put a knot somewhere where my knee might be setting down, because you'll definitely feel that teeny tiny knot if you put your knee on it, and it won't feel great. So that's the reason for that. All right, let me prep my next thread. And this is beeswax. If you're just joining now, I am coating my thread to make it easier to move through the multiple layers of denim. And then I'll just run my fingers along it to distribute the wax. All right, rethreading. That one's going to give me trouble again, so you always want to start with a clean end on your thread. That is going to help you the most. If you're having problems threading, if you're not, just go on with how you're doing it. But if you put a little extra wax on the end, it'll really stiffen up that end, and it can make it much, much easier to thread, just like that. All right, so now we have the diagonals. Let me bring my pattern back here. We'll take a look here. So we worked all of our horizontal stitches, right? Row by row, and then we worked our vertical stitches, row by row by row. And now we're going to work these little diagonal stitches here. Now notice they kind of all go the same direction, and we're wanting to follow our needle as we go. So this is the direction that we're going to do our row by rows, so that I'm working all of those diagonal stitches as I go. And here I'm not skipping over, I'm working every single group of stitches. So here, for example, I will start, bring my thread out here. So I'm going to start down here in the corner, and I'll work one row here, and then here's my second row, and so on until I reach this corner. So I'm working from this corner to this corner. So when I work from one side to the other, one side to the other, one side to the other. That's always going to be the common factor here, is one side to the other. All right, after every directional, it's a good time to untwist those pants. Your legs will tend to get twisted up as you go because you are turning your project. So here is our first row, or half of our first row, I should say. So here's one stitch, the second stitch, and then I always make that second stitch go up into the next row because it's just a lot easier than pushing it through and then putting my hand back up inside just to try and find the exact right spot. So that's a tiny shortcut for you. And then here we go. And the pattern here is a little different, so you want to rely on those marks to tell you where you need to go. All right. And pulling it through. I'm never pulling on the needle, I'm always pulling on the thread because the needle will break, but your thread likely won't. All right. So there's our second row. We have one row, two rows. Here's our third row. Okay. Flip it around because we always want to stitch out in front for ease. Get that in just the right spot here. And I'm just following the marks. All right, there's our last stitch of the row. Give it a little tug and see, there we have 3 rows finished. Now this is where I end my stitch, and I'll begin it here. So I'm going from this row up here. Diagonals can be just a little bit tricky, so take your time to think about them and what direction the stitches are going. There are 2 directions of diagonals. This pattern only has 1 direction of diagonals. All of our stitches are going in the same direction. I don't have any diagonals that are going this way. They're all going this way, if that makes sense. All right. Pulling it out, making sure that that slack exists. Oops. All right, and there is our 4th row, I believe. See that? And see how cute that pattern is? So it went from these stitches that just looked like they really were not going to come together. How is it going to happen? To something that really ends up working out. And then here, from this row, I'm going to go just above it here into that diagonal. All right, and then we work up this row here, that row. Oops. All right. So you're also wanting to kind of be paying attention to the length of your thread. If all of a sudden your thread gets really short, I hope you'll notice it right away, because it means that that your thread is tangled up on the inside. And if your thread is tangled up on the inside, you want to catch it right when it happens and not wait for a few rows down when you would actually have to probably untie it, and you might have to cut out a section. So just pay attention to the what your thread's doing. Oops. I don't know why I did that. Okay, there's our extra stitch that I mentioned earlier. That's going to throw me through a loop every time, but it's all right. There we go. And now working down this diagonal row. Oh, and then here's one. Okay, that's what happened. My rows just got really off. Okay, back in line, guys, back in line. Oops. Just kind of like I lost the path for a second. Oh, that one. That's a weird one too. Okay. Just keep going. Trust the marks. Alrighty. Go. And just a few rows left. Cute, right? Alright, and then here's our next row. And you won't have the same number of stitches in each row, which can be a little bit confusing for diagonals since you have equal numbers in your vertical and horizontal, but once you get to diagonal, it's not the same number of rows because you're working on a diagonal. What am I doing here? This little funky row is what happened here with my unmarked patch spaces. All right, now we're back in line. And top row, yank it out. Turn the pants and finish out this row and work over here next. I'm finally going to take that pin out because this can't flap over. It's just not long enough. All right, and here. And here. There we go. And then we've got up one more. There we go. And this is our final row here. And let's flip inside. I'll kind of hold on to that needle so that I can work it in a bit here. I'll just put that under there, and then over time all of the threads sort of start to wool together, those little strands, and it makes that patch is not going to go anywhere. So there you are, a little pattern, and they are ready to wear with a fresh new knee. All right, let me flip the camera here. Thanks so much for joining me. I hope it was helpful.